Hi everyone, this is Dave at Two Stroke Performance. Welcome to another TSP video. This particular video is going to cover some of the additional features of our ERM, in particular Pro and Pro Plus mode. Now, when these ERMs are shipped, every one of them comes in what we call standard mode. Now, in standard mode, the user is able to view live dash data. They are able to save a copy of their original map, flash at any time between their original map and a TSP tuned map, which comes free with the ERM. They can also read and clear fault codes, as well as use the ERM for data logging. So in standard mode, the ERM is a really powerful tool that lets you do a range of things. However, one thing you can't do in standard mode is actually modify the original map or the TSP tuned map and flash it back to the ECU. That's why we have also created Pro and Pro Plus mode. Now, Pro mode gives you all of the features of standard mode, plus it allows you to flash modified maps to the ECU within set limitations, which I'll put up on the screen now. Now, Pro mode is really designed for people who would like to make some changes, but are quite happy to work within some safe limitations to reduce the risk of doing damage to their engine in case they make a mistake with the tune. It still allows very effective tuning, but it's not unlimited. There are limitations on fuel, ignition and oil, just to help guide you in the right direction when making changes. On the other hand, Pro Plus mode gives you everything that Pro mode gives you, plus it has unlimited changes for fuel, ignition and oil. So that means that you can adjust fuel, ignition advance, or the amount of oil, plus or minus as much as you like. So in this video, we're going to go through the various processes involved in, first of all, activating Pro or Pro Plus mode on your ERM, and then also how to actually use either of these modes and flash a modified map to your ECU. So let's begin with the process of activating either of these modes on the ERM website. So in order to activate Pro or Pro Plus mode, we need to go to the ERM website, which is tsp-erm.com. You need to log in using the details that you had previously set up when you first registered your account. Once you're logged in, you'll see the details of any saved devices that you have listed under your user account. In order to activate Pro or Pro Plus mode, we need to go to Additional Features. And then under Additional Features, you'll see a list here with Pro mode, Pro Plus mode, and then the two reset options below. So in this particular video, we're just going to look at Pro mode and Pro Plus mode here at the top. You can see here, with this particular ERM device that I'm using for this video, I have already purchased Pro mode in the past. So this time around, I'm going to purchase Pro Plus mode. Normally there would be a price attached. In this case, I'm using a test version of our website, so the prices are $0, but the process is exactly the same. Now, any prices listed here are in Australian dollars. So in order to activate either Pro or Pro Plus mode, press Purchase. It will then take you to a payment confirmation window. Press Proceed to Payment. Normally, at that point, when there's a price attached, it would take you to a payment gateway to finalize the purchase. Once the purchase has gone through, you'll see this green note at the bottom, which says, please generate a new registration file here and upload it to the device. You'll also see beside Pro Plus mode, it now says purchased on today's date. So we'll go back down to the bottom, we'll click the link here. Now this link takes you back to My Devices and into Device Info. Down the bottom here, we need to press Download Registration File. You'll see in the bottom left corner of the screen, the registration file has been downloaded. Now that registration file contains the code that the ERM will recognize in order to turn on the Pro Plus mode that I've just purchased. So each time you purchase a new activation with the ERM system, you do need to download a new registration file, save it to your computer, and then send that file to the ERM using ERM Manager. So I'll now go to ERM Manager. Often when launching ERM Manager, you do need to launch with administrator privileges. Once on the main ERM Manager screen, the ERM which I have powered here, I have one beside me at this computer. This is connected via the supplied USB cable in order to supply it with power. The ERM should appear here. If it doesn't, press refresh until it appears here on this list. Click on it to highlight it in blue and then press connect. Now the ERM Manager software will connect to the ERM using Wi-Fi. Once it's connected, you'll see here it gives you the various details of the ERM. We want to go to the registration tab and press upload registration. We now need to find the registration file that we downloaded just earlier. Almost instantly, the file is sent to the ERM, and if it's successful, you'll see this message. Press OK, and then if you come back over here to additional features, straight away we can now see that Pro mode is activated. So the process is very, very fast. So now if we were to use the ERM, instantly we would see that that we were able to make unlimited changes to fuel, ignition and oil, which is what Pro Plus mode offers. If we had activated Pro mode, we would be able to make changes, but there would be those limitations that we discussed earlier. So now we've got the ERM mounted on the bike, and I'm going to run through the various screens relating to modifying the ECU mapping. I'm not going to go through the other features because they are covered in other videos, but specifically I'll talk about how to modify fuel, ignition and oil, and how to save those modifications, how to use the different profiles, and how to flash a modified file to the ECU. So when the ERM turns on, it automatically goes to this dash screen. To modify map, you need to go to the tune screen, so press the tune button, or you can swipe across from the dash screen. When you go there, it will straight away take you to this map, which will give you a choice of either original map or TSP tuned map. Obviously, I'm doing this video with the assumption that you've already paired the ERM to your ECU, you've already downloaded the TSP tuned map and done all of the other initial registration items. So assuming you've done all that, you'll see this window here. From here, we can choose which map we either want to flash or modify. So in this case, I'm going to go to the TSP tuned map. And it then brings you to this window here. Now, on this window, this has been explained in another video, but I'll do it again very briefly here. So across the middle, we have our profiles, 1 through to 5. And we also have the blank page icon, which at the moment is highlighted in blue. Now, whichever one of those, either the blank page or the numbers 1 through to 5, whichever one of those is highlighted, is the one that is relevant to these buttons at the bottom, modify, flash or erase. So if we have number 1 highlighted and we press either modify, flash or erase, it's going to do any of those actions to profile number 1. So these profiles, each profile allows you to make a different set of changes to both map 1 and map 2 regarding fuel, ignition and oil. And the reason why we had multiple profiles is so that that gives you an opportunity to create multiple different versions of the same map. So you may use all 5 of these profiles during the course of one afternoon doing some tuning, or you may for example, save each profile with a different name for your favorite tracks. So you can use the profiles in various different ways. Now, when we're on the blank page icon, the modify and erase buttons are grayed out. So the blank page icon basically means that we will flash the TSP tuned map without any changes to the ECU. So that's why modify and erase are blanked out, because we can't erase the TSP tuned map, and we also can't in this case with the blank page icon, we're not going to modify it. If you want to make it select any one of the profiles, in this case I'll do number 1 and then press modify. From here it takes us into the fuel map 1 window. If we swipe across, it'll take us to fuel map 2. Again, swipe across, ignition map 1, ignition map 2, and then oil for both maps. So going back to fuel map 1, Just to give you an example of how we would make changes, if, for example, our bike was, say, a little bit spluttery at part throttle and we had determined that we wanted to remove a little bit of fuel, I would use the highlight the cell that you want to take fuel out on using the arrow buttons here, and then press the plus and minus buttons to add or subtract fuel. So in this case, we're going to subtract fuel, so we'd press the minus button, and I'm going to start just by subtracting 2% fuel. So that's 0% throttle at 1500 RPM. Bearing in mind what we talked about earlier on with the concept of interpolation, making a change here in this individual cell will impact everything from 1500 RPM through to 3000, and from 0% throttle through to 15% throttle. I was talking about the concept of a bike that was a little bit spluttery at part throttle. So we may go along and make more changes at various RPM points, and I may determine that at 6,000 and 7,500 it's acting particularly rich, so I may make a slightly bigger change there of 3%. But then in order to be safe, I'll leave 9,000. Now, I can then go along and at 15% throttle also make a similar change. Maybe I'll just make 1% change at 15% throttle. If I've been riding the bike and using the live dash data, I may have noticed that the bike's only spluttery at, say, 5 or 6% throttle. So that's why I'm making it the bigger change at 0% and a smaller change at 15%. Again, using the concept of interpolation, I know that that means that at 5 or 6%, it's going to have an impact. So I may make those sort of changes. Then on the same tune, I may want to add some fuel up top. So especially when the bike is making good power. So this is a 300, this particular bike. So I know that peak power is around about 7,500 or 8,000 RPM. So I may want to add 3% of fuel from 50% throttle and up in the area around peak power. So I would add 3% at 50% and 7,500. I might add 2% at 9,000. I might add just 1% at 6,000. And then I'll come down to the 85% throttle range and add similar amounts, maybe 2% at 6,000, maybe 2% at 7,500, and just 1% at 9,000. So that might be the sort of sensible change that we'd start with. Certainly a change of 3% is about as much as I would do at any given time. Normally I would make changes in the order of just 1 to 2%. But let's say in this example, I've already made, I'm familiar with the bike, I know kind of what it can handle, and I'm comfortable making a change of 3% or so. Moving over here, just to give you an example, this particular ERM has got Pro mode activated. So Pro mode is the mode that does have some limitations on the changes that can be made. So moving to a cell right off to the side, I'm going to keep pressing plus until I hit the maximum. So there you go, 10% is the most, is the biggest change that it will allow me in Pro mode. And likewise, if I go all the way down into negative, minus 10% is the greatest magnitude of a negative change that I can make as well. Now you'll also notice that when I make negative changes to fuel, the numbers go red, and when I make positive changes, the numbers go blue. So a negative change in terms of fueling is taking away fuel, so that's making the bike leaner, which theoretically can pose some sort of risk if you don't know what you're doing. That's why we make those numbers red. Likewise, adding fuel or increasing the percentage with a positive number is almost always safe. Sometimes it will reduce power, it may make the bike a bit boggy, but adding fuel is always safe. Subtracting fuel is always, in theory, potentially risky. So that's why the numbers go either red or blue. So moving across, let's say we are, but also potentially we could put the bike under a bit of risk. So let's say, for example, that I've determined that I want to bump up the ignition advance through the meat of the mid-range, so maybe around 30% to 50% throttle, and maybe 4.5 and 6,000 RPM. So I might add 2 degrees of advance in that zone. Now you'll notice adding, in this case on the ignition table, adding advance has made the numbers go red, whereas if I come across here and subtract, the numbers go blue. So again, this is related to what is deemed to be potentially safe versus potentially unsafe. So reducing ignition advance or subtracting ignition advance is always going to be something that's on the safer side, whereas adding ignition advance, yes, it can get you more power, but it also potentially could be an unsafe change if you don't know what you're doing. So that's why on the ignition tables, adding advance or going to a positive number is red, and going to a negative number is blue. So let's say that for this ignition table, that's all I want to do right now. So I'm just adding a bit of advance around mid-throttle and mid-revs, and that's all I want to do. Again, for map 2, I've decided I don't want to make any changes. And for oil, even though I'm working with a TSP tuned map and I'm comfortable that it's got enough oil, I may, just for safety's sake, add 20% oil in a few areas, maybe down low. And also maybe at wide open throttle, like peak power. So 7,000 plus, I might add 30% or thereabouts, just to be extra safe. So they're the changes that I'm happy with. So once I am ready to, I can save this map. Now, before I save it, I can also give this profile a name. So if you hit the pencil icon and then press edit, you can then delete the name there. I'm going to do this in capitals. Now, this keypad obviously is a little bit small, but it's a very, very useful tool being able to name these profiles. So I'm going to call this my map. Even though the letters are very, very small, it is quite intuitive, and it normally will select the correct letter. If you need to, you can always delete by pressing the delete button, and when you're finished, you can press the tick. So rename to my map, press OK. And then once I've done that, I need to save. So I need to press the disk icon. So I can press that. It does give me a warning because I've made changes that have come up in red. So that is subtracting fuel and adding ignition advance. It will always give me this warning just to let me know. So I will accept those changes, and then I'll save to my map. So now when we come back here now, profile number 1 has the name my map underneath it. And if I now wanted to flash that change to the ECU, I would simply press flash. It'll say flash 3-22-R5 IRK-my map to ECU. Now 322R5 is the name of our TSP tuned map that has been loaded to this particular ERM, and -my map is simply saying that it's using that TSP tuned map and it's adding the profile, which we've called my map, to that tune. So we'll press flash. And once it's done, you'll see this notification that it's completed successfully. So press OK. Now, let's say, for example, we had ridden with Profile 1 or My Map overlaid onto the TSP tune for a while, and we decided that we wanted to go back just to the standard TSP tune with no other changes made. So in that case, we would go back to the blank page icon and press Flash. Now, doing this will flash that same TSP tuned map, 322R5. It says unmodified to the ECU, so I'll press Flash. So that, as I said before, the blank page icon means that there will be no further changes overlaid to that map. So when we flash that map, which I'm doing now, we are putting the ECU, we are flashing the ECU with just the standard TSP tuned map with none of our own. So that's completed successfully. So now our ECU has been flashed again with a standard TSP tuned map, 322R5 in this case. So let's, again, theoretical example, let's pretend that we've been riding with the TSP tuned map and we want to start making some changes again. And we knew that we were previously quite happy with Profile 1, which we'd named My Map, but we wanted to make some small adjustments to that. So we can now go to Profile 2, which at the moment we have made no changes to. We could open it or press Modify. Rather than re-entering all the information that we had from Profile 1, if we decide that we were quite happy with Profile 1, we want to start off from there and make some additional changes. If you press the double page icon near the top, this will say, this says select profile to copy from. So we know that we're quite happy with profile 1. I'm going to select that as a starting point. And so what it does is it takes all of the changes that we'd previously made in profile 1 and imports them into now profile 2. So from here, we could make more changes. So for example, I may decide that I want to take out even more fuel in this spot. So I may go to a couple of cells. Let's say it's 4,500 and 15% throttle, and take out another 2% fuel. And I may do the same at 6,000. And then I may even extend that a little bit and blend it in by taking another 1% off there and another 1% off there. Now I may also go across to the ignition map, and I may think that the bike is starting to get a little bit aggressive just off idle. So I may take out 2 degrees of advance in a small window down low. Now this is something that you may do in a hard enduro setting. If you want very tractable power just off idle that minimises wheel spin, you may reduce ignition advance there, for example. And let's say that I'm quite happy with the mid-range. So that's some changes that I could make to the ignition map. And let's also say I've been doing a lot of, on the oil map, I've been doing a lot of hard enduro style riding, very low revving, and there's a bit of spooge coming out the exhaust, or excess oil coming out the exhaust. So I may return these values down here to 0, which would put me back to the original oil map values that I had, but I'm going to leave the extra oil up top at 7,000 RPM, the extra 30%, just for extra safety up there. So now I could, I'm ready to save this profile 2. Again, I might name it, edit profile name. I'll use capitals again, and I'll call it my new map, and then press the tick button. So I've named it. I now still need to save it. So I press the save icon and accept. Save my new map, yes. So now I've got 2 profiles. Profile number 1 is saved as my map. Profile number 2 is saved as my new map. I now would like to flash profile 2. So with the number 2 highlighted, I simply press flash, accept the notification, and it will now flash my new map to the ECU. Completed successfully. So let's say a lot of time has passed and we've filled up all of these 5 profiles, and they're all used, and they're all ones that we want to, let's say some of them are ones that we want to keep, and some we don't necessarily need. If you want to erase a profile, if I go back to number 1, I can press erase if I want to totally clear it. Or another option is you can save a backup of these profiles using ERM Manager, so that you can load profiles back into the ERM at any given time in the future. So you may save these first 5 for various track conditions or various riding locations, erase them all, start again, create another 5 for different track conditions, save all them, and then maybe create another 5. So you may have, say, 15 different profiles that you've saved if you're doing a lot of riding in a lot of conditions, or maybe you from time to time, so you may have, say, 15 different profiles that you've saved if you're doing a lot of riding in a lot of conditions, or maybe you from time to time would change the setup of your engine with different compression ratio heads or different exhaust pipes. There are some people out there that would potentially need multiple versions of these profiles for different conditions. You can name each profile so you know what it's for. So yeah, as I said, you can back up these profiles. Now, one thing to bear in mind with the profiles is that profiles are only relevant to the individual map that they were created with. So these profiles that I've created in this example can only be used with this map, which is called 322R5. You cannot take a profile and use it over the top of another map, simply because you don't know what those percentage or ignition changes are going to result in. So Always remember to only use a set of profiles with the same TSP tuned map or with the same original map. If you change the TSP tuned map, the ERM will delete all of the profiles and force you to start again, just so we avoid the situation where someone may have created a profile where they subtract 10% fuel everywhere, and that may in some cases be appropriate for one particular map. If you then use that same minus 10% change everywhere on a new map, it may make the bike way too lean and cause some engine damage. So just keep that in mind, that profiles are always linked to the map that they are created for and cannot be transferred to other maps. So that pretty much wraps up the tuning features on the ERM. Obviously, everything I've gone through under the TSP tuned map section, exactly the same features are found for the original map. So it has its own set of 5 different profiles that can be modified, named, flashed, erased. They work exactly the same as the TSP tuned map profiles. So therefore, in total, between the 5 profiles for the original map and the 5 profiles for the TSP tuned map, you have 10 different profiles, plus the original map itself and the TSP tuned map itself. So there's another 2. So in total, you have up to 12 different maps that you can store on the ERM at any given time, which, to be honest, is far more than what most people need. Most people, in my experience, and certainly for my own tuning, will be fine with 1, 2, or 3 different profiles laid over the top of one or both of the original map or the TSP tune map. Likewise with Pro mode, with the limitations that are set, so that is plus or minus 10% fuel, in terms of ignition, minus 5 degrees up to plus 3 degrees of ignition advance, and with oil, minus 50% oil up to plus 100% oil. Those changes are more than enough to suit the vast majority of riders under normal riding conditions, whereas Pro Plus mode, which allows unlimited changes, would be more suited to either someone with extreme engine mods or a workshop that really wants to experiment. However, if you're using our TSP tuned map as a base, in my experience, it would be rare for you to need, for most people to need any more than Pro mode with its limitations to make some very, very effective changes to either an original map or a TSP tuned map if needed. So one thing that's really important to understand when using the ERM to make some mapping changes to fuel, ignition, or oil is the concept of interpolation. Now, in I guess the most simple forms, interpolation is simply the concept of when you make a change at 2 different points, those changes will also impact all the other points between those 2 different points. And the simplest way to explain that really properly is to show you on the whiteboard. So at the top of the whiteboard here, I've got essentially a representation of one of the modification windows on the ERM. So in this case, I'm going to pretend that this is a fuel table. So we have our RPM points, 1500, 3000, and 4.5. And then we have throttle positions, 0%, 15%, and 30%. Now, on the actual ERM, we do have more RPM positions and we also have more throttle positions. But to get the point of interpolation across, this is enough information. So if you have a look in the first row at 0% throttle, at 1500 RPM, I have a 0 change. Now, for the purposes of this, when we're talking about fuel changes, we're always talking about a percentage change. If we're talking about ignition past 15%, let's say at about 25% throttle, over here we'd have roughly a change of minus 1%. So hopefully you can see by going from +3 to -3 back to 0, as you roll the throttle on, assuming that the RPMs stay exactly the same, you'll get varying amounts of changes to the fueling. So another concept that's really important to understand when you're making fuel changes in particular is the concept of a lambda value. So when you make any changes using our ERM, what that is doing to the ECU mapping is changing the lambda value. Now, lambda is essentially a way of representing an air-fuel ratio. Without going into too much detail, roughly speaking, a lambda value of, say, 1.0 is quite lean, and a lambda value of 0.60 is quite rich. So as you move from 0.6 up to 1.0 or thereabouts, now these numbers can go lower than 0.6 and it can go higher than 1, but generally on most bikes, you'll find values between around 0.6 and 1.0. As you go from 0.6 up to 1, the engine will get leaner. So the closer you are to 1, or the higher above 1 you are, the less fuel you're putting into the engine. So if we're making a fuel change, and let's say just looking at this 30% throttle range, if I change all of these to 10%, now one thing that's really important to understand is that even if you are making the same magnitude changes here, a 10% change will give different results depending on what the base value is that it's changing. So in this example, if the 1500 RPM column had a lambda value to begin with of 0.6, when we make a 10% change, we're adding 0.06. In the 3000 column, if this one was lambda of 0.8, we're adding 0.08. And in the last column at 4500 RPM, if we add 10%, we're adding 0.1. So even though we've got the same 10% change here, it's very important to understand that the resulting change you get can differ depending on what the base value is. Now, with the current version of the ERM, you do not know what these base values are. You don't know 0.6, 0.8, 1.0, or whatever it's going to be. All you can do is tune by percentages. Now, this is still a very, very effective manner of tuning, as long as you understand that concept that even if you have the same values here, you're not necessarily getting precisely the same change in the underlying map. So the way to get around this is always to do small percentage changes, particularly with fuel. Personally, when I'm using an ERM to adjust fuel on the dyno, I would make changes of 1 or 2%. I would only ever make a bigger change than that if I really knew what I was doing, if I really understood that map, usually only if I already know what these values are. So for every other tuner at home or trackside, strong suggestion is never make a change of 5 or 10% at a time. Go by 1 or 2% and gradually see or feel the difference that makes at that particular RPM point and that particular throttle position. Doing that will give you the best chance of doing some effective tuning and minimizing the risk of doing damage to your engine. Regarding ignition advance, when you're choosing using the ERM, any changes made in the ignition tables relate to a particular value that's measured in degrees. So if you have a value of +3 in one of the cells, what that means is that the ignition will fire 3 degrees earlier than what it did before. So I'll just do a basic example here. This circle essentially represents the rotation of the crankshaft. Top dead center is up the top here, and the crankshaft is rotating this way. Usually ignition advance will take place before top dead center. So as the crank is rotating this way, before it gets to top dead center, the spark may fire, let's say, at 20 degrees before top dead center. That would be a fairly normal amount of ignition advance, through the bottom end or mid range. So with this particular example, if we were to add 3 degrees to that, what that would mean is this value of 20 would go to 23. So it would actually shift a little bit earlier. So that means that the spark would occur for top dead center or earlier, and depending on how you tune, hopefully that would make a little bit more power. Using this example, I'll just go through each of these ones one by one, just using the red numbers here. So we've got +3 at 1500 RPM, -3 at 3000, and 0 at 4.5. If our underlying advance was 15 degrees at 1500, 20 degrees at 3000, and 18 degrees at 4.5, using these changes here, what we would get is 15 would have 3 added to it to give 18. 20 would have 3 subtracted from it to give 17 degrees, and 18 would stay as 18 degrees. So if we were to make these changes to this underlying set of ignition advance values, we'd end up with a fairly consistent ignition advance of about 17 or 18 degrees all the way through. Now, if you're wondering what these values are, the ERM doesn't allow you to view those underlying ignition values that are contained within the ECU, But if you do go to the dash data window, the secondary dash data window that shows a range of different values, you can see what the ignition advance is in that moment. And if you hold the throttle and RPM at a particular spot, you can start to get a good feel for what these values are. Generally, what you'll notice is that through the bottom end and mid-range, the bikes might have, maybe 18, 20, 24 degrees of ignition advance, sometimes higher. Now, for most 250s or 300s, peak torque will be around 7.5, maybe 8,500 RPM. And then as the RPMs build beyond peak torque and peak power, you would always see the ignition advance tail off down to 10 degrees, sometimes below 7, 8, 6, whatever it may be, depending on the needs of the engine and the pipe and the fueling and all sorts of things. And the reason why the advance always tails off after peak torque or peak power is to put more heat into the exhaust, which extends the working range of the pipe and therefore extends the over rev and the rev range of the engine. One really important thing, similar to our discussion earlier on about fueling, one really important thing is to always make small ignition adjustments. So always start with a change of just plus or minus 1 or 2. Never go straight to plus 5, plus 10. Always start with small changes. Particularly if you're working with one of our TSP tuned maps, the ignition curve on those has already been relatively optimized. There's usually not a huge amount to be gained, depending on what your engine setups are. By all means, we always leave a little bit of power on the table that you can access with the ERM. But generally speaking, if you're working with any of our tuned maps, the fueling and definitely the ignition advance will be relatively well tuned and shouldn't need big changes up or down in order to get maximum performance of the engine. Bearing in mind that that does depend on which base map you're working with. So obviously if you're working with a more aggressive, say motocross style map, that will definitely be already quite crisp and very well tuned. If you're working with a more hard enduro style map, generally that will be richer and have less advance, and there's a lot more room to move on ignition and obviously on fueling with one of those style maps. So the next area that we need to talk about is oil. When you're making changes to oiling on the ERM, the table is a lot smaller, but it still looks essentially like this, similar to what I've used for the explanations for fuel and ignition. Any oil changes are made in percentage terms. The ERM will allow you to go up or down in 10% increments. So if we were using this first row here, we would have 10%, 30% and 0% would be one example. Given that it is in percentage terms, the interpolation works exactly the same as what I described for fueling. So here, if I change these values quickly to multiples of 10. So if we look at this green example here, at 1500 RPM, if we start at 10%, then at 3000 RPM we go to 30%, which would be somewhere there. And then 4,500 we go to 0%, which again means no change to the underlying base map. And we joined up the dots. We could then see that at, say, let's say 2,500 RPM, which would be around about here, would have, say, let's say 2,500 RPM, which would be around about here, would have a percentage change of somewhere around 20 to 25% as an example. So oiling works in a similar way to fuel. As I said, percentage changes, it will interpolate between the different RPM points and also the different throttle positions. I guess a word of advice with oil, even though with Pro mode, it will allow you to subtract up to 50% oil and add up to 100% oil. Generally speaking, there would be very few circumstances where you would want to remove oil from the mapping. Usually, the more oil you have, the safer the engine will be, and also usually the more power it will make. If you're working with one of the TSP tuned maps, they always have more oil in them than the equivalent stock map for that same bike, but you can always add more. So you may choose, down low to add 10 or 20 or 30%, for example. Certainly, if you're working with a stock map, I would definitely suggest adding some oil to that. Again, certainly in the range of 10, 20, 30%. If you're running a very specific application, a highly modified bike, you may want to add more than 20 or 30%. But as I said, there are very few reasons why you would want to have less oil, with the exception being if you are running an injector relocation kit and running premix, in which case you may want to turn the oil off entirely. Now, there's two ways to do that. One way is to using Pro Plus mode, set all of these values to minus 100%. Or a much easier way, beneath the table on the ERM, there's a checkbox that says set oil output to 0. If you activate that checkbox, it will basically disable the oil pump. And as I said, the only time you would do that is if you were choosing to run premix and were injecting on a TPI bike, were injecting through an injector relocation kit. In time when we offer an ERM for the TBI bikes, on the enduro models, you will be able to check that checkbox, set the oil pump to 0, and just run premix much more easily on those. So the final thing to touch on in this segment of the video is power valve changes. Now, currently the ERM only suits TPI models, but we will be releasing a version for the TBI models and the Sherco 300 Carby models very soon. Now, both the Sherco bikes and the TBI bikes have a servo power valve. For those versions of the ERM, you will be able to make power valve changes. And the way the power valve mapping or modifications will work will, similar to oil and fuel, it'll be a percentage change. So you will be able to pick certain RPM points and be able to go up or down on the power valve position based on a percentage change. So you may be able to select, say, 4,500 RPM and choose to have the power valve 10% more open than what it currently is. So all the things I've explained earlier in both the fuel segment and the oil segment will apply regarding interpolation, having an understanding that if you make a percentage change, obviously the value of change you get is based on the original or underlying value that you're changing. But we will offer servo power valve changes, and again, it's a very, very effective way of tuning and unlocking extra power by, in some cases, opening the power valve a little bit earlier. Or another scenario might be if you're running a pipe that works at a much higher RPM point, you want to get back some of the lost mid-range power by keeping the power valve a little bit closed for a little bit longer. So again, it's a very powerful addition to the ERM.